I am going to speak here so I can use the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
this is perfect.
Okay.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Good evening. In April 27 of 1983, President Reagan gave a speech to Congress to ask Congress to approve his request to send money to Nicaragua in support of the so-called Contra movement, a military group that was created by former Somoza supporters to fight the Sandinista government that had overthrown Somoza in 1979. The Somoza family had been in power in Nicaragua since 1937. And life was not easy under the Somoza regime for the people of Nicaragua, as the Somozas imposed a dictatorship over the country, suppressing all civil liberties and incarcerating and murdering political opponents. In fact, Somoza the father came into power after murdering Augusto Sandino in 1934. And who was Sandino, you may ask? Well, Sandino was the leader of an armed rebellion against the US military occupation of Nicaragua. Yes, in 1927, the United States had occupied Nicaragua for the second time. The first occupation of Nicaragua by US Marines had taken place in 1912, and one of its aims was to prevent Nicaragua from building a canal to connect the Pacific with the Atlantic that would compete with the Panama Canal. Before withdrawing troops from Nicaragua in 1933, the US helped Anastasio Somoza become the head of the National Guard. From his position as head of the National Guard, Somoza seized control of the whole country, imposing military rule with the backing of the United States. Fast forward several decades until 1993, and we have President Reagan asking support to intervene in Nicaragua internal affairs one more time. You can watch the speech by President Reagan from the President Reagan Library. It's on YouTube. I tried, but the volume is not working here tonight. In fact, during the 1980s, the United States government not only financed and trained the Contra Army, they also backed the repressive military regimes of Guatemala and El Salvador. For instance, with regards to El Salvador, $40 billion were sent in US aid, 70% of which were used for military purposes. The high levels of violence that were reached during the 1980s civil wars forced many civilians into exile. So, the first significant wave of Central American migrants came to the US during that time. According to the Migration Policy Institute, migration from Central America more than tripled as a result of the civil wars of that period. For instance, before 1980, just 90,000 Salvadorians lived in the US, while more than 2 million live here today. The so-called Civil War period came to an end in the early to mid-90s with the end of the Contra War in Nicaragua in 1990 and the signing of peace accords in El Salvador in 92 and Guatemala in 96, respectively. Still, the end of the politically motivated violence and repression of the Civil War period did not mean the end of a high violence context in the region. Much to the contrary, violent crime has steadily increased in Central America since the end of the civil wars. And this is the reason why Central Americans are fleeing their countries again in such large numbers again. The prevalence of homicides is most acute in the so-called Northern Triangle formed by Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, where between the year 2000 and 2010, more than 100,000 people were killed. And here you can see the per capita homicide rate for each country. According to a study undertaken by the United Nations Development Program, Central America is experiencing the highest level of non-political violence in the world. That means that most of the violence is related to gang activity, extortions, and drug trafficking, and it is not politically motivated. Nevertheless, there are political roots to these problems that can be traced to the legacies of the civil wars. Let me explain this with regards to gang violence. The most dangerous Central American gangs are the MS-13, also known as Mara Salvatrucha, and Calle 18, 18th Street. That these two gangs were formed in Los Angeles, California, where many Salvadorians and Guatemalans found refuge during the civil war of the 80s. After settling in the US, they struggled both with war trauma and with precarious living conditions, discrimination and cultural alienation. In many cases, their children found a sense of belonging and self-respect by entering local gangs and in turn imported gang culture from American inner cities such as LA into their countries of origin after returning to Central America. At the same time, in the last decade, there has been a flood of international investment in large-scale development projects, such as biofuel plantations, tourism, and open-pit mines across all of Central America at the expense of the indigenous communities of the region. To impose their will, corporations often employ private security forces that work in close collaboration with the military and the police. They also use gang members to threaten local communities. As a result, killings, intimidation, and violence against indigenous and environmental activists has become an everyday occurrence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And you may have heard about the most prominent cases, such as the assassination of Berta Cáceres, an indigenous leader from Honduras, murdered in March of 2016. In short, the recent rise in migration from Central America corresponds with the new surge in crime and violence in the region. Like they did in the 1980s, the people from Central America escaped to survive. In what follows, I am going to give a short overview of the US involvement with Central America prior to the 1980s, in order to illustrate that the United States' presence in that region is one of the factors that has contributed to the creation of this high violence context that for decades now has been pushing people out. Historically, one of the main hubs of the United States in Central America has been the Republic of Panama. Panama gained independence from Colombia in 1903 with the support of the United States. In return, Panama allowed the United States to build and operate the Panama Canal. Controlling the Panama Canal gave the US not just a commercial, but also a geopolitical advantage. Yet, Panama protested for decades that the 1903 treaty signed by both countries did not imply cession of territory and the absolute transfer of sovereignty over the canal zone to the United States. What Theodore Roosevelt did in Panama is known as big stick diplomacy because he sent warships to the coast of Colombia in order to show US might and readiness for military intervention if deemed necessary. This intervention set the tone for the way in which the United States dealt, not just with the Panamanian government from then on, but with Central America as a whole. The other historically significant American investment in Central America is very well known to all of us. It's bananas. To talk about bananas, allow me to go back to Costa Rica at the end of the 19th century. In 1881, the Costa Rican government signed a contract with an American entrepreneur named Minor Keith to build a railway line that would connect the capital of Costa Rica with the Port of Limon on the Caribbean coast. This contract gave Minor Keys a vast amount of land in the areas surrounding the new railroad. Keith used his land to create what would become a very lucrative business: large-scale banana plantations to produce cheap fruit to be sold to the United States, Canada, and Europe. Although there were other banana companies, minor Keith's company dominated the trade, becoming almost a monopoly after merging with the Boston Fruit Company in 1899. That year, the United Fruit Company was born. By the 1930s, the United Fruit owned 3.5 million acres of land in Central America and the Caribbean, and was the single largest landowner in Guatemala. And so, I am going to focus on the role played by the United Fruit Company in Guatemala and how it contributed to creating a long-lasting, high-violence context in that country. Between 1931 and 1944, Guatemala was ruled by a dictator named Jorge Ubico. During his 13-year rule, Ubico eliminated all political opposition and democratic activity in Guatemala. Most importantly, he replaced Indian slavery with vagrancy laws, which required that indigenous people work an assigned number of hours on certain plantations in order to maintain a steady supply of workers among landowners. It goes without saying that the United Fruit Company, being the largest landowner in the country, profited tremendously from Ubico's vagrancy laws, which guaranteed them a constant supply of free labor. Not surprisingly, Sam Zemurray, the head of the United Fruit Company at that time, was a close ally of Jorge Ubico. In 1944, the people of Guatemala revolted against Ubico's dictatorship. And so the privileged position of the United Fruit Company was also threatened. Indeed, in 1952, Jacobo Arbenz, the democratically elected president of Guatemala, launched an agrarian reform to put an end to the large estates and the semi-feudal practices, giving the land to thousands of people, raising their purchasing power and creating an internal market favorable to the development of a domestic industry. This included expropriating idle land on government and private estates to be redistributed to peasants, mostly indigenous people, in lots of 8 to 33 acres. The United Fruit Company was among the expropriated big landowners. The Guatemalan government did offer monetary compensation, but not high enough according to the United Fruit Company expectations. While the Guatemalan government valued $2.99 per acre, the American government valued land at $75 per acre. In other words, the Arbenz administration was willing to pay $500,000 while the United Fruit wanted a total of $16 million for the expropriated land. As a result of this, Sam Zemurray organized an anti-Arbenz campaign in the American media. This included the claim that Arbenz was a communist and a threat to the Americas as a whole. At this time, the President of the United States was Eisenhower. Significantly, two key figures in his administration had close ties to the United Fruit: the Secretary of State, who was John Foster Dulles, and the CIA Director, Alan Dulles. The Dulles brothers convinced Eisenhower that Arbenz was indeed a communist and a threat to the Free West. Eisenhower authorized Operation PV Success to overthrow the Guatemalan government in August of 1953. The coup took place in June of 1954. It was organized by the CIA, funded by the US, and backed by US-supplied Air Force. Arbenz agrarian reform was reverted, with land being confiscated from small farmers and returned to the previous large landowners, including the United Fruit company. The Guatemalan military officer who was the local head of the operation cracked down on unions and peasant organizations, arresting and killing thousands. This was the onset of a civil war that lasted 36 years and in which 160,100 people were murdered, 40,000 disappeared, and more than 1 million people went into exile. I hope this brief presentation helps understand that people fleeing Central America today are not economic migrants. Very much like in the 1980s, the people who live in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are not driven by the promise of a better life in the United States or elsewhere. Instead, they are escaping to survive. To them, it's a matter of life or death. What is more, there is a reason why the people from Central America flee their home countries and, in many cases, come to the United States. What connects the US with Central America is not just geographical proximity, as Reagan argues in the speech I couldn't show you, but political involvement, and with involvement comes responsibility. Thank you.